Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're joined by administrators from three of the Valley's leading employers to discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion, both the initiative and the careers in this area. The discussion will be the basis for an upcoming cover story for Inside Pennsylvania magazine. You'll also find a separate version in addition of the daily item. I'd like to welcome our panelists. We have Nikki Young, Associate Provost for Equity and Inclusive Excellence at Bucknell University. Kim Drumgo, Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer with Geisinger. And we have two from Susquehanna University, both Dena Salero, Director of Student Diversity and Inclusion, and Michael Dixon, Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer. I want to thank you all for being a part of this discussion. So why don't we first talk about the terms of DEI to begin. Diversity, which I found to be the presence of differences, such as race, gender, religion, orientation. Equity, promoting justice, impartiality, and fairness. And inclusion, which is an outcome where people from diverse backgrounds feel welcome and are welcomed. And I remember that being something that Nikki pointed out at a talk at Campus Theater, the difference between feeling welcome and being welcomed. So in what ways do you most commonly find reluctance or lack of understanding, both in the terminology and the application of DEI initiatives? And Michael, how about we start with you?
Thanks for the great softball question to start off with. To me, I feel like part of the reluctance that I don't want to take away from my colleagues here with this is the equation, or the way that people equate equity with equality. If I treat everybody the same, then that should be good enough. And what we've realized in our work, I don't want to speak directly for Nikki or Kim, but I know for our work here at Susquehanna, we are very cognizant of the fact that not everybody comes from a similar background or has similar experiences coming into Susquehanna. And so we need to be very cognizant of that, and we need to adjust the way that we deliver our services or deliver our programming in order to meet the needs of people where they are and not necessarily where we believe that they are.
Nikki, I'd pose the same question to you.
Thanks, Eric. Happy to answer that. And I concur with Michael here, and just want to say thanks to you and to my colleagues here for joining in this conversation. I'm really happy to be here. One of the key elements of diversity, for example, that really throws people off is they think that it's located in an individual. Right? And diversity is one of the terms that opens up our ideas of relationality and community. So it's a term that describes what is in a place and how we orient that space, right? So you might not say, for example, that person is diverse. It actually doesn't say anything. Diverse means different from what? But you might say that pool of people is diverse. This context is diverse. And then you get to ask questions about how to generate diversity within that pool. What sort of markers of difference exist? And once you recognize those markers of difference, then you can actually talk about differentials. So then if those markers of difference are imbued by power and access and those things, really a focus on equity is a natural response to a diverse environment. How is it that we make sure in this environment that we've cultivated that we provide equitable access to the resources that we have, both necessary and flourish oriented? And then inclusion is different totally in my mind from diversity and equity, because it's about how those relations inform people's experiences. So for me, starting with an idea of diversity that's really based on relationality and community kind of shapes the way we think about the other elements.
Kim, can you talk about what exactly a career in diversity, equity, and inclusion involves?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I do want to add, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and, being in my role at Geisinger for 90 days. This is definitely an opportunity to hear what others are doing in my community and then provide some insight. And so thank you so much for having me.
I had forgotten it had only been 3 months.
Yeah, yes, it has. And so I do want to just add a little bit, just really quickly to the question that you had before, what is diversity, equity, inclusion? I think, very short, diversity is who we are. It's all of the differences that we possess. And I agree with Nikki is that, we don't have diverse candidates. You have diverse pool of candidates and diversity is who we are. Inclusion is what we do with that diversity. It's how we include it at multiple levels, how we include those voices when we're having conversations or making key decisions. And then one thing I think is missing from the diversity and inclusion equity equation, equity is then the output, right, of that diversity and inclusion. But I think we miss how people feel, and that's the key component around belonging, how you feel in the workplace. And so we need to focus not only on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also how people feel so that they are able to be their best selves in a trusting and productive environment. So I always want to make sure that I include that language around belonging. Your question is around, what's a day in the life of a DE&I professional? My goodness, we could spend all day talking about that. But in my role at Geisinger, the key aspect of what I intend to do is to infuse DEI and belonging, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into the fabric of our culture. And that includes making sure that we're integrating these key messages, key behaviors, and competencies into our training, into our leadership training, into our leadership style, into our language, and into our behavior. And that involves touching every corner of the organization, whether it be from the top office to facilities, even in finance. There are behaviors that we as individuals need to demonstrate to ensure that we're meeting our goals and objectives of creating a trusting and inclusive work environment. It includes training, competency, compliance. It includes, recruiting. It's in that recruiting space. It's in the talent development space. It's in how we care for our patients. And so our jobs on any given day, I'm talking to our, patient representatives, to our CEO, and to anyone in the organization, and coaching and training on how we can continue to create an inclusive environment and how we measure that in terms of engagement and our representation across the organization. So it's a lot. Like I said, we could talk about this forever.
Dena, for you, where have you identified biases in your workplace, be it subtle or otherwise, within the realm of DEI, and what steps have you taken to address them?
So you tossed me the one that really requires a little parsing out here now.
Don't worry, that's going to go in another direction as well.
Good morning, everybody. As my colleagues have said, I'm very happy to be here this morning. And Kim, it's especially nice to meet you virtually, especially after just 90 days on the job. So hopefully we'll get a chance to interact soon in person.
Absolutely.
So what ways have I personally encountered bias, or if I worked with others in bias incidents, or both?
That you have identified.
So pretty much have identified bias in many, many forms at Susquehanna, but it's not unique to Susquehanna. So in the realms of race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, sometimes biases may come out in the form that would be directed at those folks from a lower socioeconomic status, religion and spirituality. So basically all the ways that we can be different, as my colleagues have referred to, are also areas where I've witnessed identified and worked with folks through bias situations. And very often, these aren't situations where somebody has malintent. So intentions are often good ones. And sometimes it's just a casual conversation, but it's these implicit biases that wind up coming out in conversation, relationships, and work that accumulate for people. And it's that cumulative effect then that winds up being at one point a tipping point where somebody may either report it up through me or speak with a trusted friend or colleague about how it's influenced them. And then generally we work within a relational context, which I like the way that Nikki, put part of the definition to work through those bias incidents and to address them.
And Nikki, I'd turn back to you on that same topic, where you've identified biases at your workplace and how you've addressed them. And I asked that question because I've read about firms changing how they do performance evaluations, or using new analytic and data science to reduce potential biases.
It's a great question, and I especially appreciate what you've offered, Dena, to sort of frame how we think about biases and the responses to them. I think a bird's eye view is helpful here. So on the one hand, we could talk about them in terms of incidents, right? So things that happen, interpersonal sort of interactions that come from places of bias that may be, let's say, non-malicious in intent, but still have the same sort of effect. But there's something else, especially in institutions like the ones that we're all a part of, which has to do with the processes for change or processes for further development. So let's say we want to diversify the community. We want to bring more people here. The slow stages that we have to go through to make those kinds of changes are actually reflections of some of the biases that we use when we approach those alterations. So we might say things like, well, I'm concerned that we might not have the resources, or I'm concerned that people wouldn't fit here, or that they wouldn't want to stay. I'm concerned that, so those sorts of concerns, let's say, which really do slow down opportunities for transformation and change, reflect biases that we have. So in addition to them happening in these really strange but innocuous interactions, they also happen at large levels. And part of our response is both to think about these interactions and help people understand their personal sort of orientations and perspectives and shift them, right? So we can't take away the biases, but we can have them shifted and responded to in really clear ways. And then also to take a step back and think about how those same biases are influencing broad-based change. So at our university, one of the things that I'm really proud of that the university has been doing for a while is making sure that among our staff, work related to diversity, equity, inclusion, professional development, service work, engagement is a part of the evaluation process, right? It's a part of each year's reflection. And we're working on that on the faculty side. As we hire new people, we look for people to articulate what they're doing in teaching, research, and service related to equity and diversity and inclusion. And we're working right now on the possibility of having this as a part of our retention, tenure, and promotion plan. And this is a significant process that might be infused with some concerns, which will illustrate some of the biases that I'm talking about. So, you've got large structural possibilities to respond to, and then you've got incidents. And thinking about those as really different things is important, at least in my experience.
Michael, by what metrics is success in your role measured? How do you judge that you're making an impact?
I think for some, there are two ways to approach this question. There are the numerical metrics in the sense of, are we, again, taking the words from my colleagues here, diversifying our workforce? Are the numbers increasing of people who are maybe underrepresented or minoritized in our particular institutions or workplaces or work areas? And then there's the other piece about going back to what was said earlier about how people feel. But that to me is that's a different metric to sort of unpack, because while I might feel good, there might be individuals in the community that may not feel as good. And therefore, I can't say that we are making progress or that we're successful when there are individuals in the community that don't feel like I'm being represented. I don't feel like this is my place. So to the allusion from colleagues from earlier, like our work is never done. We could talk about this work all day long. And we may say, look at all the progress that we're making, look at the individuals that have come here, look at the great initiatives that we have set forth, look at the great things that we can talk about. And yet, if one person or a group of people don't feel included, don't feel like they belong, don't feel represented, don't feel like they're being heard, then to me, like I'm not gonna say it negates the work that we're doing, but it does temper and causes us to believe like we need to be working harder, to ensure that the work that we are doing is reaching everyone. So metrics, very difficult. I like to believe that we are doing good work, and obviously we are all in this work because we hope and believe that we are going to be making the changes that we want to see. However, it's difficult sometimes where we're not basing it on numbers, but we're basing it on how people feel.
Kim, I'd ask the same question your way. I feel like feelings, I mean, that's seems like an impossible thing to measure, right? And you can't, you can inquire, but you can't specifically measure.
Yeah, and so the way that I measure, we often see the lag measures, right? That snapshot in time. What does our student body look like? What demographics do they represent? We do the same thing with our workforce. And so those are the lag measures. Those are the things that happen after you do the work. And so I try to focus on those lead measures, which are those things that influence process. They influence the way that we do work and the way that we behave versus the numbers at the end. And so, measuring feelings in the work environment by asking pointed and directed questions around, is your voice heard? Do you feel like you can, do you feel like your suggestions are being taken into consideration? When in the classroom, do you feel like your professor respects you or your teammates or classmates respect you? Those are, indicators that would point to feelings and how I feel like I belong. And so my lead measures are around, how we educate and those behaviors that are actually being demonstrated in the organization. We leverage engagement survey results. I'm measuring how, as we're recruiting, I'm measuring each step. Are we making sure that we're following process that eliminates bias? Are we following processes that ensure that we're casting that wide net to identify talent for our organization? And so those are the steps that you need to measure. How often are we doing the things that are best practice to get to that end result? Those lag measures, that's the key. You measure your progress along the journey, not just one stop along the journey. So, I always say that, as we're going through this journey, there will be ways that we know how to measure ourselves. And are we following? No different than how I am when I drive from North Carolina to Pennsylvania. I'm monitoring my speed. I'm monitoring my gas. I'm monitoring to make sure I get to that destination. I'm checking my car before I get into it. I'm monitoring my tech. You've got to monitor the whole process to ensure that you're getting to that destination. And that's how we should be looking at, our growth and our development along this DE&I journey.
Well, to that regard, Dena and Nikki, in what ways have your respective universities changed, since DEI initiatives have been really a focal point?
Well, I think that in some of the ways, going back to Kim's analysis of those lead measures, I think that we have implemented quite a few of those. And so those lag measures, and I'm using your language, Kim, because I really do love it, they're to follow, right? They're yet to be seen because we've implemented a lot of new initiatives within the last 2 years, actually. And so we had a major university initiative called Census, where we gathered faculty, staff, and student voices to discuss which parts of the university really needed DEI, a broad DEI kind of a look, and identified 32 to 33 different areas. And we specifically worked through those areas over the course of a year with some specific measures, goals, and potential outcomes. And in that, we were able to identify some of those things that would come before. And so specifically things around recruitment, for example. So making sure that in that process, we had a diversity advocate that was part of every search that we did at the university, so that we didn't find ourselves at the end of a very difficult and sometimes failed search, and then reigniting it and going out for another one, coming up with the same type of pool of people over and over again, because some of our systemic bias would rule out those who weren't a good fit. And so, part of it was doing things that were very specific and measurable in our processes. And that census work really got us to dig deeper. That was just one initiative, but it was a huge one because it really involved a lot of voices. We have also made some conscious efforts to reorganize ourselves in ways that elevated the work of DEI. And that's just been over the past several months. We've created a division of inclusive excellence. And now our work is really to put forth our mission and not just become another division and department on campus with a snazzy name and some new digs. So we are, crafting our mission and some of the goals that we'd like to be accomplishing throughout the course of this year. Part of that, one of the very specific things that we've done just this past fall is created a diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum for our faculty and staff, so that we can be building our infrastructure, since that's what stays and our students turn over, so that we are really creating the place where we want to work and where our students will thrive. Toss it over to Nikki.
Thanks, Dena. What incredible work you all are doing at Susquehanna. It's really, truly awesome. And we're doing some similar things actually at Bucknell. One of the elements that we discovered in the last couple of years, especially as I've jumped into the role, is how DEI work seemed to be located in the responsibility of a few people on campus. So one of the big changes that we've made is that each university division, so athletics, library and technology, communications, arts and sciences, all over, every single one of those has a DEI council or a working group. And so they are responsible for the specific goals and processes and shifts in their division. They have their own set of professional development. And our office and the folks in it, we liaise with them, but it means that there's really significant shared responsibility and buy-in. And when I tell you that these councils are doing amazing work, they're supporting one another in learning, in building lexicon, but also in making shifts related to their field or related to their areas. So it has illustrated, one, that these are community-oriented conversations that support individual growth and professional development, but they're also things that support shifts and changes in culture in the environment, in the work environment, that better support our students. So that's been a significant change for us. We too have developed a curriculum for our faculty and staff. So there's a curriculum, and we hired a director for equity and inclusive excellence whose main job role is educating our staff and faculty related to diversity and inclusion, large issues, more detailed issues. And our new director of the Office of Accessibility Resources also does some of this work too, to infuse concepts within our conversations so that we're better serving our students and creating a work environment. So those are some of the things. Now, some of the pieces that have been in process and have gained more momentum in the last couple of years is our admissions team, which our enrollment management, that is, which has its own DEI council, has done amazing things with their plan, with how they are recruiting students that involve recruitment and retention sorts of goals and that bridges them with other divisions in the university. So really kind of strong short-term and long-term plans divisionally has helped shift the work responsibility. And we've seen it in our capacity to attract different students and different candidates for positions here at Bucknell. And we'll be looking for the sort of lag information. Thank you for that. That language related to our retention goals, right? So a lot of this is in the past couple of years. And then there are some curricular shifts that we are making. People are doing it both in localized spaces, right, in departments, but then there's, across colleges, we're talking about particular curricular initiatives, like race across the curriculum is one of those.
Kim, keeping in mind you've been at Geisinger 90 days, I want to pose this question to you and Michael. Where might you have stumbled or encountered failure with respect to enhancing DEI so far? And, how have you pivoted and what have you learned?
Yes, I've been doing this for quite a while. And, and what I have found is that, as DE&I professionals, we have to meet both the organizational culture and individuals where they are in their understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that was one stumbling block that I made early in my career, probably in the first year of me getting into the space. I was ready for the organization to be at the highest, utmost mature level in diversity and inclusion, and skipped over the foundational pieces, which are some of the things that Nikki mentioned: creating a common language, creating a common understanding as to why we're going on, while we're approaching this journey, and ensuring that the organization had the tools, resources to fall back upon should there be some stumbling blocks and not a huge understanding. And so at my time at Blue Cross and Blue Shield, I said, we're doing this. We're going full steam ahead, 100 miles an hour. And we're going to jump into, just more, advanced practices around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which was, we're going to, recruit diverse talent, but we didn't have an organizational culture to receive that talent, right? So it's almost like you've got to clean your culture, make sure the culture is welcoming to diversity before you bring in that diversity, or else you'll have that revolving door. Another example was, we're going to have conversations about race. People really didn't understand about diversity, equity, and inclusion and affirmative action. So really starting with foundational understanding and making sure everyone has that knowledge so that we're growing on the journey together. And I always say the journey together because it's never ending. Just making sure that as a professional, we're very tuned into where the organizational culture is. What's the strength of that culture? What are those undercurrents and nuanced behaviors that need to be taken into consideration as you're building out your strategy? One size does not fit all, and just because you did it at one organization, it may not work at this one. And so I'm very careful now, later in my career, to assess, to do my due diligence and assess where we are, what the mindsets are, come up with a plan on how to shift those and create more understanding and a depth of awareness, and then begin to implement process change, because anything other than that will spell failure.
Kim, you bring up some very great points, and one that I continuously get reminded of, which is the why. Mm-hmm. Why are we doing the work that we're doing? And the fact that we've been doing this work for X amount of years, everybody else has not been doing this work X amount of years. And so for us, it may come as natural. Like, yes, of course, we're going to do this because that's just the right thing to do, from the moral imperative. But for some folks, I mean, they're still maybe focused on the business imperative, or they just don't understand why this is important. And so we have to take time to explain that. And as a person who started at Susquehanna 3 years ago, my work was primarily, before the Dena made mention of this new division of inclusive excellence, my work primarily was single person. So try to cut across all of these different areas as a single person, essentially trying to do it all. Like it's not possible, but you're just assuming that people are coming at this work the same way that you're coming at this work, and that this is what we need to do. The other thing that, in terms of stumbling blocks that Eric made mention to was just recently, and Dena made reference to this as well, the curriculum that we included for the faculty and staff. One of our kickoff events included a gentleman from Oklahoma who had a very storied career in Congress, J.C. Watts Jr. Well, in doing your research about J.C. Watts Jr., you later realize that some of his positions, particularly about the LGBTQ plus community, have been contentious and or maybe not in line. No, I'm not gonna say maybe, are not in line with many of the DEI principles that we put forth. So bringing that gentleman to campus and including him in the curriculum was a contentious point for some folks, because they're saying, how can you include somebody in the DEI conversation who essentially doesn't fit or doesn't espouse the values that you are trying to espouse with DEI? In my mind, I'm thinking, well, that mindset is still part of the conversation, but you have to frame it as such. And one of the faux pas is that I myself and the division didn't frame it as such. And so including it with no explanation, now there's a conversation happening on the back end of folks, why was he included? He has this very troubled history, and yet, you put him as the centerpiece or the very beginning of the curriculum. Now we have to, essentially not undo the work, but talk about how those voices still need to be included, how we need to vet those voices in a way that is appropriate, and how do we challenge the way that people think about DEI, not only for a certain group of individuals, but that everybody can, again, back to the points we were making earlier, can feel included and part of the conversation.
Yeah, Michael, I have this saying that I said, it's not that you need to include the different voices around the table, the different thoughts around the table. And it's not for any one person to be right, it's to get it right. It's to get the implementation right. It's to get all of the insight that exists in that organization, so that as you're mapping out your strategy, you've considered all of those points of view, so that you have a chance of, really creating something that everyone sees themselves as a part of.
I think it's fair to say that the four of you work for progressive organizations, and we work and live in a conservative area. The Valley is very conservative, and I don't know your all opinions on how diverse or not the Valley is. I imagine it's not all that diverse compared to where you might have been before. How has and by the way, I attend a lot of school board meetings virtually or in person, and I've heard parents push back against initiatives like DEI at these meetings. How has the current political climate added more stress or complications to the work that you all do? And Nikki, I'd pose that one to you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that question. You know what? We live in the United States of America, and while the Valley might feel and be more conservative than the places, for example, I went to grad school in Atlanta, spent a lot of years there. So the Valley feels very different from that sort of city to me, but it's not altogether different from the broader contexts of racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, classism that exist in the United States. What we see is a much more liberal use of language that suggests that hierarchical ways of thinking about human beings is acceptable, and that structures and processes and systems and rules and cultural engagements that support those hierarchies are normal. So that's what we see. And so the response that I think we have to have is to, destabilize what seems to be a norm. Like, actually, no, culturally, we ought not organize ourselves in these ways of hierarchy, because it's illegal in a lot of contexts, and B, it is not productive for the community. So I think, is it different? Sure, it's different on a basic scale. Like I could be living in New York City, but it's not altogether different. And so the sorts of responses that we have to have look like what at least I've been doing since I've been in college, right? Challenging our assumptions and biases that render the hierarchical arrangement of human persons as normal. And so doing that in a localized community conversation is not that different from doing that in a faculty meeting, right? Like, I mean, they feel the same. And I think that aspect is really important for our colleagues and friends to understand. That, and I'll speak for myself as a Black queer woman living in Central Susquehanna Valley. It does not feel different for me to articulate human worth and my sense of self or rights or privileges if I'm standing in the middle of Market Street in Lewisburg, or if I'm standing on the floor of the faculty. If I'm having to articulate those ideas about personhood, about equity, about inclusiveness, and it feels like a defense or an argument for something that has a moral imperative, it feels the same. And that means for me that this distinction often that happens between what seems like our progressive institutions and our local community actually manifests as a kind of new classism, frankly, a new set of discourses that look like that the people who are not in our institutions don't have the same sorts of exposure, education, and world experience to understand a liberal frame, when really it's the opposite side of the same coin, in my understanding.
Anyone else care to chime in on that topic?
I think Nick did a great job.
Yeah, beautiful in a lot of ways. I think that that dichotomy that's created, right, the progressive institution and the local community really does, I think, further a lot of division. Because to Nikki's point, you can be among lots of folks that have language down and that have nuance down, but where sentiment and aggressions and so many other things can still be very present in that room. And sometimes that can even be a more difficult situation because you can't quite pinpoint it, but you know it's there. You can feel it, it's in the water. Whereas sometimes in your local community where the specific language may not be down to address certain things or to mask, it's very blatant, and it's also very harmful, and it's difficult, and it's exhausting. But you, in some sense, know what you're addressing, and it can be clear. It can be clearer. But I think that too, we have to, as institutions, also do as much as we can to sort of bridge that perceived divide, because I think that there is where we can come together in some really authentic conversations. We have a lot to offer, but so does our local community. There's a vast array of diverse experience and backgrounds that exist. We may not see it in the visible, but there's a lot of the invisible diverse factors that operate. There's class, there's race and ethnicity that may not be visible. There's different religious backgrounds. There's sexual orientation and gender identity, and just so much the way families are put together. And sometimes meeting people there with some sense of an authenticity and humility really opens up that conversation and can invite folks to attend some of these events and be part of it. Because for a lot of people in local communities, whether it be a school district or an institution of higher education, stops people at the door. Because automatically they feel like crossing over, they'll be judged. They're going to be cast back into, a system that marginalized them in some ways. And so I think more of an openness to that perceived divide can be really helpful in this work.
So how might internal successes in your roles benefit the communities beyond your work environments? And I'd like to start with Kim and we'll go around the horn.
Sure. As I interviewed for this role, anytime I go to a new city, one of the first things that I do is go to the local grocery store. That tells me a lot about the community that I'm in and the people that I would be around. And so, I went to, in Danville, I went to Weiss, and then I went to CVS Walgreens. I'm not sure what they call it here, but I think it's the CVS Walgreens. Then the next day I go into my interview and I tell the story. I can tell a lot about a community by going into the grocery store and the local drugstore. And to a lot of what Nikki and Dena have said, the diversity, is not so obvious, but there is, socioeconomic diversity, there is religious diversity, there is your regional diversity, transplants in, and then the people who've grown up in this area. And so there's a lot of diversity in the community. And so as I thought about this role, and I thought about the role that Geisinger plays in its community, we're not the organization that's trying to reflect the diversity of the communities that we serve. We're an organization that can infuse the diversity of who we bring to this community. And that's an opportunity for individuals who may not have, a chance to go to a different state or go to, even a different country. We have that diversity that we can, infuse and educate our communities about. And help them understand that it is because of our diversity, our inclusion, that we're able to provide better care for you, state-of-the-art care for you. And so that's a different conversation, that we're planning to have with our communities, is that, here's how it's helping you. And here's how we can expose you to, cultures and backgrounds that are different than yours. Because I have found that even in my conversations in the grocery line, it's, there are the hard left and hard right thinking individuals, and that's to be understood and expected in communities. But then there are individuals who say, I would like to learn more about that. I'd like to learn more about where you're coming from, or where you came from, or what brought you here. And so those are the golden nuggets and the opportunities that organizations like ours need to take advantage of. There is curiosity. And even when there's a little curiosity, just the exposure creates a different understanding and awareness that I think can incrementally bring about change in thought and change in how we thought about diversity, how we think about people from different countries or with different accents. I think exposure is critical to creating change.
Michael.
I want to build on what Kim just talked about. And interestingly enough, I've had some recent conversations with some quote unquote local individuals about some contentious issues, which, earlier in my career, I may have approached it in a different way. But I think just based on the work that we've been undertaking over the many years, if somebody has a different viewpoint from you, if you immediately meet them with some initial hard resistance, they're going to shut down. And I think part of our work is to get people to think about things in a different way, with maybe hopes that they would embrace DEI. But I think to a lesser extent, that at least we initially have a conversation. So I had a conversation with the person, works blue collar, lives in Turbitville. And his initial conversation was about the Colin Kaepernick situation from 2016. And his viewpoints on, how it was perceived in the media, and his take on it, and then my take on his take on that situation. It then morphed into, and then I think you're sort of making reference to this with the school board conversations, critical race theory, and his thought on critical race theory and how it's a bad thing, and et cetera. Now, mind you, I don't feel the way that he feels about that situation, either one of those situations. But if I immediately come with, well, you're wrong, and this is the reason why you're wrong, like, we're going to be met at an impasse. But I think if we approach it from, all right, let me hear what you have to say. Now, if I were to send you some resources that may contradict or make a different point, would you be open to reading those or at least listening to those? He said, yes, I'd be open to listening or reading those. Great. As you said, that's the nugget. That's the light. That's the opening. It leads to then maybe having a broader conversation about educating yourself on not just hearing what you hear in the media, but then also triangulating that information with other resources to have a more informed conversation so that maybe we don't approach this conversation in the future with such negativity, but to then say, oh, while I initially read or thought this, somebody sent me something, I read this, and I think differently about this situation. So I think for us in the work that we're doing, at least in this area, I try to have an open mind when going into those situations. And I already know that when I tell people I do diversity, equity, and inclusion work, in this area, they're already met with like, okay, so what is that? And then I tell them, I'm focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. If they have some idea, oh, okay, that it could be that response or and then, there's a shift to a different conversation because of the uncomfortability of those topics and the lack of understanding, and application in their life.
Can I just jump in real quick, Eric, to co-sign what Michael and Kim and Dena have said here? I think it's really important to talk about these strategies that people in our roles take on, right? That they require particular practices of listening and reflecting and engaging in conversation. Those things are really important as we're doing it in university and hospital and other large institutional settings, but they're also important as we're building relationships in the community. And there is a limit to whether or not we will engage in those same practices when the question has to do with, do we think differently politically? Do we disagree on a particular matter, let's say, of action? Or are we talking about the sort of full humanity of one person or another, the way that we can treat certain people? And I think sometimes those expectations that we will, listen and we will reflect in a way that is respectable to our community comes at significant cost. So I do think that our community members and our colleagues in these institutions have to know what cost it is for us to take a step back and listen and reflect, even when that is a best practice, right?
Dena, the question, how might internal successes in your role benefit the communities beyond your workplace?
So, I do frame the larger framework for me in all of this work is really around justice. And I think that small successes in some of the work that I'm doing, and then some of the work there where it may be, crossover into the community, can be tremendously beneficial both ways. Because I think that when we frame conversations that way, we can almost always get to a place where the person we're speaking with has experienced some sort of injustice. And that can be a real place of understanding and then to build from there. Because I want to live in a just world. Not necessarily a fair world, not necessarily a world where everybody has the same amount and all of that sort of thing, but one that's just. And typically other people do as well. When it comes down to it, they really do want that. It's just a matter of how do we get there and what's the perceived amount of stuff that you have to give up to get there. And so I think that in ways that we get there across the board on campus, for example, can really translate in other ways to the community, can translate to those in the high school, for example, and to those that might be facing some more difficult access to healthcare, as another example. We can typically find it and find that common ground to talk about. So I do think that this is all really the same work, just in different categories, but it's really a very similar kind of work. And I've heard a lot of, and we do in our circles, really make reference a lot to making sure that people have a seat at the table. And then we take it, further to like a voice at the table, making sure that you have input. But I know that I was raised in a large family, an intergenerational family with my grandmother and my great grandmother, and I always had a seat at the table. And I typically had a voice. We all have a very loud voice at our table. But we always knew whose kitchen it was. It was my grandmother's kitchen. So you ought not to rearrange that furniture or things like that. And I think that sometimes that analogy can go a little bit further because, what we're really asking for is that people have the ability to rearrange the kitchen in a lot of ways, not just sit down at somebody else's table. So while we are talking about belonging, we're also talking about that ability to see structures in ways that benefit us all, and not just that we're invited to a space that has been created by somebody else. And I think that sometimes when we engage in conversations this way, there's a clicking of it because we've all experienced that in some way. And I think that that sort of gut feeling, if we can get down to that when we're in conversations with people, we're on much more common ground than we anticipated. I hope that makes some sense.
Nikki, I was going to leave the last answer to you.
Well, thank you for that. I think that, a sort of broader wrap up for me is the work that we're doing matters in both small and large ways. And it involves a kind of commitment to our colleagues, to our students, to the community that reflects deep values of equity and inclusion and an appreciation for diversity. And because we're working together doing those things, we have to have some wiggle room for people to meet us where we are and for us to meet them where they are. This is not to say that we capitulate to standards of acceptance and engagement and what used to be called tolerance that are below what we hope for, but it means that we're open to helping people, as Kim said, along the journey, right? And for me, that means a kind of willingness to have compassion, but also to declare boundaries, a willingness to have kindness, but also to be very clear about what our expectations are, and a willingness to be truthful at every point about what we're oriented towards in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So for me, the sort of bird's eye view is, yes, let's work together, and we're working together towards the sorts of goals that make all of us better and feel supported as individuals and within the community.
Well, I want to thank you all for your time today. Thank you so much. And thank you all for watching.